Selam and hello everyone. This is Lilly. As you know, we're on a break, but in today's Best of series, you're going to hear from Abdi Latif Dahir. Abdi came on the show and talked about who tells your story. Since his episode aired, he has been traveling all across the region, and in particular, bringing us stories from Sudan. There have been several articles that I've really appreciated that he has written. A few that I would highlight are the ones where he's written about women who are pregnant in Sudan and what this war has done to affect their experience with bearing children. Another beautiful article he wrote about how the war is threatening artists in Sudan. I would really highly recommend that you follow his Facebook page. He posts his articles there, as well as other really amazing content from around the continent, book reviews, cultural pieces. I found that Abdi is really kind of the hub of the news that I want from the continent, both the beautiful curation of the wonderful, joyful pieces, as well as the justice news that we need. So follow him on Facebook. And in the meantime, enjoy this episode with Abdi Latif Dahir, the East African correspondent for the New York Times. Powdered milk. You had me until you said powdered milk. Then I was like, oh. The Nido, I don't know if I can do the Nido in my teeth.
Exactly. This is like a thing. It's like my mother's always like, this fresh milk. I was like, no, you don't understand. It's just something that takes with this goddamn Nido.
Oh my goodness. Abdi, karibu sana. So happy to have you with me this morning.
Thank you for having me, Lilly. I appreciate it.
So Abdi, for our listeners who may not know you yet, but I hope they do, please tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your work.
I was born in Nairobi, Kenya, and spent the better part of my life here, but I also grew up in Mogadishu, Somalia, for several years of my childhood. And so I like to say that, my head is in Nairobi, but my heart is in Mogadishu. I'm a journalist. That's the one thing that I wanted to do all my life. I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be a writer, particularly. I studied university in Kenya. I went for my grad school in Columbia Journalism School in New York. And I have worked with local publications here in Kenya, and, regional publications covering the region. Before 2019, I, for 3.5 years, was working with Quartz, which is a digital publication based out of New York. I worked in their New York offices, and I also covered East Africa for them as a journalist. And then in 2019, I joined the New York Times, where I took up the title of East Africa correspondent. And that essentially means that I cover several, up to like a dozen countries, both in East and even a bit of Central Africa. So that's sort of like, that's the span of like the journalism that I've been doing and I'm currently involved in. Yeah.
Good. Thanks, Abdi. I remember seeing your byline first pop up with reading the Times. I have to say I am a subscriber. I actually pay for the Times. So now, they do have the firewall up, but I also, or paywall, whatever it's called, but I actually pay for my subscription. And I remember seeing your byline come up and then seeing the announcement about your post. So it's not just that you're the East African correspondent for the Times, but you are the first East African to hold that position. And that really mattered to me. It mattered to me as an Ethiopian, as a Nairobian of, many years. Does that matter to you? Tell me, as somebody who's always wanted to be a journalist and wanted to be a storyteller, what did that title mean to you?
Well, first, it mattered to me because it was a dream come true, right? This was a journalism job that I had wanted for a long time. And when I was living in New York, I made, connections with some editors there and I really wanted to work at the Times, as would many other journalists, for many, many years. And but it also mattered to me, as you say, because that I was appointed as the East Africa correspondent because I come from this region, right? I belong in this region. I am ethnic Kenyan Somali, but I also partly grew up in Somalia. I have family all across this region, from Tanzania to Ethiopia to Djibouti to Sudan. Families and friends in different capacities. So it was very important for me to also be able to have the opportunity to write about the region where I have my roots at, and where particularly also it came with a huge responsibility in that when I write these stories, they're not just going to be read by our global audiences, whether they're sitting in, in Hong Kong or London or New York, but they're also going to be read by family members and friends who are in this region who are going to more or less question and push back and be like, yeah, we don't agree with this point. We don't agree with this coverage. Why did you focus on this issue? Why are you not writing about this issue? So it was also like I knew that I was taking on like a big job in that sense. But also I think finally, representation matters, right? I think there's something deeply powerful about seeing someone who looks like you, who speaks like you, taking up a space in a powerful media outlet. And as a young Kenyan Somali, I grew up listening to Ahmed Hassan Auke, at the BBC Somali. And this is, generations of Somalis will tell you that he was the familiar voice that wherever you are, whether you are in the refugee camps in Dadaab or whether you are in Minneapolis or whether you are in Australia, that he's the voice that everybody tuned to listen when the BBC Somali service came in. And then, of course, I also grew up watching people like Rage Omar being at the BBC or at ITV and watching his journalism also at Al Jazeera. And there's something that comes with that I think that is very important. And it wasn't lost on me when I was appointed to this position that I was also taking up a bit of that. And it's very important for me because it's not just important that we tell our stories, but that we also inspire the next generation of journalists, the next generation of storytellers who are going to be able to tell the story of this region and Africa and beyond in a way that is more nuanced and much more complex.
Thank you for that answer. You've said so much there, so I want to have a conversation with you. You said so much about why both representation matters and also the tremendous responsibility that you carry, as a son of this place, as a journalist who has all kinds of integrity that you must uphold in your reporting, in your fact checking, especially in this era, right, where misinformation is rampant. So I'd like to just to follow up on some of the things you said about that responsibility, because you have written about the region, of course, that's your job, but you've also written about the personal suffering that you've experienced, about the death of friends in Mogadishu. Tell me kind of what that costs you to both hold pain of when things happen in the headlines in Mogadishu, in Nairobi, in Addis Ababa. It's not just a headline for you, right? It can feel personal. What is that like for you to hold the facts of a situation and also the pain and the weight of it as the son of this region?
That's a fantastic question, Lilly. I think where I would begin is that it's very important to place people and their personal stories and place more value on those stories rather than just the numbers, right? I think when you hear about dozens of people killed in Ethiopia or like terrorist attacks that are recurring in Somalia pretty much like every other day, I think it's, important, and we have a responsibility to bring those stories to the readers. But we also have a responsibility to build relationships with those readers. And how do you build relationships with those readers is not by writing the figures, 10 people have died, this is what happened, this is the context. No, I think people have an innate desire to relate. That's part of us as human beings. And I think that doesn't come by chance. It's not cultivated by chance. It is good writing, good reporting, narrative storytelling that in many ways allows us to create that connection. And so when we report some of these stories about attacks, usually what you will see, for instance, in our reporting is that we will have like a day story, where we would say, this is recently in October, there was October or November, I can't remember the exact number, but there was a major attack in Mogadishu and over 120 people were killed. And so we will have like a first day story where basically we're now reporting, this is the number of people who are killed, this is what happened. We're basically reporting the facts. But on the second day, we almost always follow up with a story where we're now digging into who are these people? What were their ambitions? Why did this attack happen at the Ministry of Education? Why were all these students lining up? Is there an accountability journalism there in that, the government and the security forces, did they fail these people to make sure that, their security was guaranteed when they were in this place? And I think we do that because we have a responsibility both to those people, but we also have a responsibility to our readers. And it's something that, I and the people at the desk, at the international desk, take very seriously. But it's also in terms of like building that connection with that emotional connection with the readers. That is when we start hearing from readers. It's on the second day story about, when you talk about, for instance, the attack that happened in Mogadishu on December 28th, 2019, where 81 people were killed. And all of, when we wrote about, I went to Mogadishu actually, and I wrote about, how one of the buses that was caught up in this explosion was the bus full of medical students in a country that is very poor, war-torn. These were the next generation. This was the hope that the country was waiting for. A lot of them were about to take their final exams and graduate. And I wrote about some of the family members, some of the victims who died in that attack, and went into the bedrooms of some of those. There was this one family. This was the only kid who had ever gone to high school. He was the only kid who had gone to like college. He was about to graduate from medical school. And one of the things that I described in the piece was like about his handwriting, because his father just like had all his notebooks around him, and he was looking at those handwriting, and he just like kept saying that, I remember how he would always like this cursive handwriting. And somebody wrote to me saying that, when they got to that part of the story, they couldn't even finish the rest of the story because they're like, that was for them in many ways, like, it showed the agony that the family was going through, that they just didn't lose this one person that was very important to them, but also the particularities of like losing that person and the ambitions that the father and the mother had for their kid. Yeah, I think for me, it's very important to like, yes, we report the facts, but we also have to write about those people with a lot of humanity and create that connection that will bring a lot more readers to our story.
I'm moved by what you're saying, but it brings to mind a few things. One, that, in the United States, in the last 10, 15, 20 years, as the momentum has picked up for the movement for Black lives, there has been this drumbeat of say their names, right? Because we want to humanize those victims and not just have a body count, but we want to bring humanity to these tragic stories. And yet so much of what I'm hearing you say is it's a tremendous responsibility, but also a tax on you that I just wonder if it's a tax that you would not carry if you weren't a Kenyan Somali, if Mogadishu did not feel like, if it wasn't home, and if that's even fair. But then I guess, you chose to go into journalism, you chose to be a storyteller. So I guess in some way you've chosen this path, but it's not lost on me the tremendous responsibility. And tell me, you've mentioned a reader who's written to you, kind of just how moving that was. You must also be hearing from readers who then also expect you, especially with a platform like the New York Times, to elevate every story, right, to the headline. And how do you manage that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think first I have to make it very clear that I pitch pretty much all my stories. It's very rare for direction to even come from New York. Yes, I do have very deep conversations with my editor about the region and what we should be covering, and they almost never say no. They as I cover, as I said, up to 13 different countries. You could write a story or two or three from each country every single day.
Absolutely.
There is a story that could be written, yes, and we're talking about a global story that our audiences are interested in. So in many ways now we have to be able to sit down and say, what are we focusing on? What matters now? How can we plan the rest of 3, 4, 5, 6 months in advance and say, these are the stories that matter. These are the people that we should be looking at. These are the larger trends in the region. And then also within that coverage of the news and following the news, and because that's our daily bread, right? That's what we are following every day. We in terms of, as you would say, the paper of record or, whatever you want to call it, but you're covering the news, and that's essentially our bread and butter. But then also there's tons of stuff happening off the news. And that's where the challenge is now, in terms of how do you focus on the arts and culture scene? How do you write about the books? How do you write about the literary spaces? How do you write about fashion, right, in East Africa and all that? And how do you make sure that those, when you cover those topics, that they are as relevant to the readers who are here as they are to the readers who are abroad who are going to read the stories? And so that's
absolutely
because yes, I think that there's a way in which we have to cover some of these newer trends and newer spaces that are coming up with the importance that they require, with a delicate, because some of these spaces are very delicate, and like any piece that comes out in the New York Times could make or break that. And so how do you cover that? How do you follow that story? How do you like really interrogate what's really going on in some of these spaces? And then, of course, as you say, like there's the readers who are writing from every, they write from the diaspora, they write, from within the region. They sometimes if they know me, they text me, they call me, I get calls from, my professors, and they're like, this story has been on the local dailies all this time, and you guys have not covered it. Like, why have you not covered it? So you get those questions, and it's very important, like, sometimes to like be able to like, to just be able to say like, yeah, I'm one person. I cover all this region. I think these are all the stories. I am aware of this story. I think it's relative. I think it's important. And sometimes, yes, we will quickly turn our attention. The other thing about this is that about coverage and framing stories is also that, do you quickly jump on the story and do like a quick news story? Do you report the story, take a few more days and do like a quick enterprise story about it? Do you take a week and a half, two, and do a feature story? Do we say, okay, this is really important, we're not going to touch it now, but we will take it up in like, I don't know, 6 months. We'll do a long investigative piece about it.
right.
Or this story has really been covered by everybody. What is it that we can say that is different? And that is where now the conversations and the, particularly sometimes, like, I think this is an important point I should mention is, as somebody who's from this region, there are things that that are every day. I take granted, every day, because it's just like, I see these things every day. But when I mentioned it to editors or colleagues who are not in Nairobi, who maybe have never been to Nairobi, and I said, "What do you think of this? What do you think of that?" And oh my God, that's fascinating. That's really interesting. Nobody knows about. I was like, "Yeah, but we've had this for 40 years. Like, I don't think it's a story for us."
Give me an example, Abdi. What strikes you as that unique thing about this play?
An example is like a story I worked on last year about the milk bars in Rwanda. So I've been going to Rwanda for years. Everybody in Rwanda sits around and drinks, they chug milk all day, every day. It's like people sit in these spaces and they're just like, in between interviews, like, we'll be like, oh yeah, the driver will be like, do you want to get milk? Do you want to get milk? I was like, oh my God, how much milk are we going to be drinking? And I've been doing this for years and years. But last year, like, I was going for this, to do a bunch of like, very, how do you say this? Like human rights related stories, so heavy stories, right? And in the final like email I was writing, I was like, yeah, maybe we should write about this. And they're like, excuse me? Like, what do you mean? Like, people just sit around. And it was, yeah. And it was one of the most read stories last year, the International Desk. It was at least the most read international dispatches. I wrote it for the dispatch section. And I got an outpouring of love and letters from all over the world, from South Korea to Alaska.
Fantastic.
Literally people just being like, these are the type of stories we want to hear. This is what we want. And again, like, it's not just about writing a positive story. I think it's about writing a nuanced, complex story about how did this country come to have this relationship with milk? What is the place of cows in Rwandan culture? How does the government come into this? How did the genocide of 1994 figure into all of this? So it's a complex story once you start getting into it. And those are some of the examples that sometimes I'm like, I'm blind to these things. So let's have a conversation. This is what I'm seeing. This is what I'm seeing. Here's an email of what Nairobi has looked like over the past few weeks. And my editor's like, oh, that's fascinating. Let's pick on that. What does that mean? Yeah.
Yeah. I love that story for so many. I mean, you think about like chai and coffee in Ethiopia, just how that's everyone, the world knows these things about us, but the milk, That is that's news to me too, and what a beautiful way to honor that country, but also tell a nuanced story. Binyavanga would be proud, I think, of that kind of story coming out of this place and adding to the portfolio of the many wonderful things that people don't know and appreciate about this culture. So let me kind of circle back a little bit to again the diaspora. I want to do an episode in the future called "The Diaspora." You can't live with them, you can't live without them, because there is this sense of they're ever present with us. The holidays are coming up soon. Nairobi, at least, and Addis Ababa surely will be filled. I don't know about Mogadishu, but there's certainly this culture of coming back for the holidays, and they'll be filling the streets. And in Ethiopia in particular, you've covered the war very extensively over the last 2 years, and I'm sure that you are hearing from listeners about that reporting, and not just your own. I'm sure you end up probably being a target at times, or the person that listeners go to with their feedback, even if you didn't write the story, if it's shown up in the Times or in any media outlet abroad. I'm sure the Times can easily be the place that people place their feedback. So I'm curious to hear, in this war that has really torn apart families in the diaspora, on the ground, it's been a heartbreak for all of us who are connected to Ethiopia in any way. Tell me, what are you hearing from readers in response to your articles? I think a secondary story to the war itself has been this tremendous engagement of the diaspora online and elsewhere with the stories, and tremendous pushback on the representation of what's happening. Can you share a little bit about what you're hearing from listeners about the stories that you're reporting on?
Yeah, and I would like to even start before the war. When the the Oromo protests were going on in 2015-16, and I covered parts of that when I was in New York, and I went to Minneapolis and Washington, D.C., where, there was a large internet shutdown in Ethiopia. And a lot of Ethiopians who were in some of these places were protesting against the government, were not able to get their voices out. So the diaspora figured really, quickly into this space and to fill this gap. And so you had people like activists like Jawar Mohammed, who was in Minnesota at the time, and sort of like, sitting down with all these activists, sort of like trying to get the message of what was actually happening on the ground. So in many ways, early on, 2015, 2016, 2017, when these protests were going on, many journalists were relying on those networks in the diaspora to get a sense of what was actually happening on the ground because of the internet shutdown, the telecommunication shutdown. And then fast forward now to the war in 2020. And the war started in November. I was not able to get into Ethiopia, but I went to the border of Sudan and Ethiopia in December 2020. And basically was at the Tekeze River, where, a lot of like Ethiopians were crossing over into Sudan. And basically were literally meeting people who had fled their homes, who had endured massacres, who had lost everything, basically, because also the war started right when everybody was about to begin harvesting, right? And
Yes.
So people walked out of their homes and, all their livelihoods and all their farms and things that they have been working on for years and years. One of the people that I interviewed in Sudan was a very old couple, and they basically had fled Ethiopia in the 70s and the 80s when the war was going on. They fled again that part of Tigray region when the war with Eritrea was happening, and they came to Sudan. So twice they had lost everything. And this was the third time that they were losing everything. And I spent an afternoon with them. And one of the things that they told me was that they will never go back to Ethiopia, because now that they were in their 80s and they have lost. So they're like, every decade we rebuild and then we have to go back, and then we rebuild and we have to flee. And so they're like, there's no point of like going back. It's done. This is, we have just come to the conclusion that Ethiopia is where we're going to be buried. And this is where our story ends. And it was interesting to hear about their aspect and their story, because they just weren't talking about their story as if it was only affecting them. They were talking about their story in the context of the larger crisis that has dogged this region. And basically saying that how many more times do people in Ethiopia, in South Sudan, in other parts of Somalia, like how many times do we have to flee? How many times do we have to come to the recognition that we're just one people? We should be living in peace. We should be thinking about the future. We already have enough troubles. And that's what like really stood out for me. In terms of like hearing from readers, one thing that I really hear about is the psychological toll of the war and how many people, families have completely, never wanting to discuss, friends completely torn apart, people who've left social media completely and have stopped keeping updated about the war. Particularly people, I'm talking about people in the diaspora. At least, if you live in Ethiopia, at least, in one way or another, you're going to come into a sense of like what is actually happening because you're living there. But I mean, people in the diaspora, including people who live in Nairobi. And so it's interesting. I also do have a friend who lives here, and every time I bump into her, it's like, you want to ask about those questions. You want to ask about how she's feeling, but ask about, how the family back in Ethiopia is doing, but it's a no-go zone. Like that's just something, and and that's a burden that she carries around with her. So that's been one thing that I've heard about. The other thing is now, particularly with the peace deal, you're starting to hear a lot about, this is a society that's completely been torn at the fabric of society has completely been torn. So what does justice look like? What does reconciliation look like? How do we move forward? What does Ethiopia look like 5-10 years from now? How does it rejoin the rest of the world and the rest of the global economy? And so that's also like another tough question that you hear. But yeah, I think the enduring thing about this war has been the vitriol and the hatred and the misinformation that has pervaded all over social media over the past couple of years.
Yeah.
And I mean, yes, I've been at the tail end of it, and it's like, you really get attacked. People write to you on WhatsApp, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook Messenger. They will find you on any platform.
They will find you.
They will find you, and they will invoke God. They will invoke Prophet Muhammad. They will invoke Jesus. They will invoke everything to, make sure that you hear their side of the point of view. They will attack your family. They will do all sorts of things. And it's, and I'm not saying that I'm even like, I'm not even their colleagues and other journalists who have just been, like the attack on them has been very, very incessant. At least for me, it's like maybe when I write a story and then it lasts for like 2, 3, 4 days, or like maybe sometimes it lasts for a week early on in the war and then it goes away. But there are colleagues who like it's incessant. It continues, and it does take a toll about. But then I just have to completely remind myself every day that we are reporting on this war and any other crisis or any other story in this region without fear or favor, and that is the motto that is stuck at the back of my mind. That we don't, we just have to tell the way this story is happening, and we have to get to the end of it. And so, yeah, that's.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I do recognize that it's, I tell my kids this, freedom isn't free. And that applies to whatever. I use it in a very parenting kind of way, but in this, it's true for any sector that we're in, free press, freedom of movement, freedom of human rights. All these things come at a cost to somebody. Somebody had to fight the battle to go there. And so in this instance of free press, I appreciate that phrase. That will stay with me, that you report without fear or favor, because it does require that in this very complex and nuanced place. Because for every story that you write of the family that's crossed the border into Sudan, there's a family that stayed and now has paid any price to rebuild, or is paying a price to, restore. I mean, the stories are endless, and we appreciate those of you who are willing to keep telling the stories. As much as the feedback you get, I'm sure is very harsh at times. I think we still depend very much on those reports because we can't get to those borders ourselves. To continue that conversation, here in Kenya, we have a new president a few months ago, and in his first conversation with the press, President Ruto, I want to read it exactly. There was just some speculation about how his engagement with with the press would be and with the media. So let me just read exactly what he said. He said, I believe in the freedom of the media and that the media has a role to play. When I criticize the media, it's because I believe in the media and I want the media to do the right thing. So kind of given the context of the conversation we've had today, Abdi, what does that statement mean to you? And what is the right thing that you think that President Ruto might be referring to when it comes to the media? Just a very light, easy question for you.
Yes, particularly because this is a young administration. But I think context is important here. Where I would start the story from is a decade ago. We have to remember that President Ruto was part of Uhuru Kenyatta's administration. He was a vice president of Kenya. And I think his administration, human rights groups, press freedom agencies, they have all documented all the ways in which that administration of President Uhuru Kenyatta, former President Uhuru Kenyatta, and Vice President Ruto, how they muzzled the press by threatening journalists with arrest, shutting down broadcasters. They starved media outlets of advertising revenue. People in government basically warning journalists that they did not have full freedom as guaranteed by the Kenyan constitution. So we have to remember that that's where we are coming from with this equation. And then, of course, during the campaigns of last year and this year, of course, Ruto did complain about bias. His campaign said that, they were not being covered well by local media outlets, and that, that his opponent, the former Prime Minister Raila Odinga, was the one who was being favored in coverage. And so here he comes, he wins the elections, and we start hearing about this thing about, the right thing to do. I don't know what the right thing to do is, but one thing that I think stood out for me is that he made those comments right after I think he was president-elect. He was declared president-elect, and before his inauguration. And we do know what happened. And he did those, and we do know what happened during the inauguration in that media outlets in Kenya. So basically what the campaign Ruto's team did is that they limited access of local television stations to the inauguration by handing exclusive broadcast rights to South African pay TV MultiChoice. And the argument was that MultiChoice is partly also owned by the Kenyan Broadcasting Corporation, but then we do know that local television stations try to get in, they try to negotiate this. When I reported that story, also President Ruto's team were like, no, there's not going to be enough space for them to park near the stadium to do this. But for many people, it was an ominous sign that this is what you're going to be doing on the first day of your presidency. And so I don't want to speculate about what's going to happen in the future, but it's going to be interesting to see how his administration is going to be able to deal with the press and how they look at press freedom, even though he's come out to clearly say that they expect to be criticized, but how much they're going to be able to handle criticism or independent reporting on the government, particularly as this phase of the honeymoon is over. It's just been 4 months so far. So, yeah.
So TBD. So I hope you'll maybe come back on the show, maybe 6 months from now. We can revisit that question and see if the right thing was the right thing. So
absolutely,
conversation to be continued.
Absolutely, and I think the question around press freedom goes beyond just Kenya, right? You look at the situation in northern Ethiopia, the Tigray region, where the war is going on. Journalists have not been able to get in there. There's an internet and telecommunication shutdown, so information is not coming out. Getting press accreditation is a full-time job in East Africa now, and I say that full-time job in the sense that you literally waste days, if not weeks, looking for accreditation, writing an email after an email, including governments asking for journalists to be cleared by the international police before they give them accreditation.
Wow.
So the question of press freedom and access to, whether it's in Sudan, whether it's Tanzania, whether it's Uganda, whether it's the Congo, it's a very, very important issue. And I think an issue that, we will need to talk about a lot more, particularly because not a lot of journalists have big media outlets who are supporting them, who are able to pay hundreds of dollars in accreditation just so that they're able to get into a country for 2 weeks. So
exactly. Yeah. And so that what you point out is so key, because we do, this is where, I wanted to have a conversation with you, because I'm sure I'll hear from people too, to say, why don't you talk to reporters from the Daily Nation, which we value and appreciate. And you were a reporter for the Nation. But the reason, you have a platform at the Times that I think very few could argue, it carries weight, it carries gravitas. There's no way anyone can dispute that. No matter which country or continent you're in, the New York Times carries the weight and the power of that platform wherever their reporters go. And the headlines you put out will make a difference. And like you said earlier in our conversation, how you report on something could change the political scene somewhere. And so we have both this tension we're living with accreditations that are hard to get for press in the region. And also we have, this African proverb, right, that, unless the lion tells their side of the story will always glorify the hunter. And so we have these talented African and Kenyan and Ethiopian journalists who want to tell the story of the hunt from the perspective of the lion and not just the hunters. They want to tell the story of grassroots movements and of communities and of individuals that not only humanize the headlines, but also, give context and give nuance and give the details that take us beyond that, acacia tree sunset that everyone envisions when they hear about the continent. And so I guess, Abdi, in your role as this East African correspondent, how much of your role is to help elevate the voices from the ground of the lion, of the communities, and how much of your role is just to simply report the facts? I know you've talked a little bit already about the pitching you do and the editorial process, but I'm really struck by both the scope of where you report on. I think you might need a few more correspondents, quite frankly, but also the depth of the responsibility and the challenges that your colleagues at local media houses face that really far outweigh what is reasonable for them to do their jobs.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question. And particularly for somebody who comes from this region, right? And who, I think one thing that I take with me on every reporting assignment is that the stories I write and the issues I write about and how we write about them, it just doesn't impact me. For me, it's just not a story. It is the story, because it will impact one way or another. And I think as humans, we like, and this is what we were talking about earlier, like this idea of relating to the issue. As humans, right, we relate to the issue much more when I know, oh yeah, the war in Ethiopia is going to decimate the economy. And when it does that, oh, I have cousins in the Eastern Somali region whose businesses will be impacted. This is how the war, on terror or the terrorism in Somalia impacts people I know. When there's an explosion, yes, you're jumping on the story quickly to write about it, but you're also thinking, oh, this is that ministry. I know this friend who works at that ministry. Like the last attack happened at the Ministry of Education, and I know 3-4 people who I literally was with in Nairobi a few weeks before that. And I got onto the WhatsApp and just quickly was like, oh yeah, while you're trying to get the facts right so that you can put out something quickly, at the back of your head, it's like, oh, okay, so-and-so it also works at the ministry. Are you at the ministry? Oh no, I was actually outside of it. Are you safe? Is so-and-so safe? So, so it takes on that issue of this is just not a story that I'm reporting. It's something that is also going to impact. I don't think I necessarily at least engage in advocacy journalism. I don't think that's our place. But I think where I engage in being an advocate is in the breadth of stories that we write. And that essentially means that first of all, saying that we are not a single story region. Like this region is not just about one thing. It's not just about disasters and civil wars and challenges, right? So we write about Burundian drumming and the complexities of Burundian drumming. It's featured in Black Panther, but Burundian women are not allowed to play this. So what does this say about Burundi? What does it say about Burundian culture? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we also write about, I leave a story like that and we go write about hunger in Somalia and the politics of famine and what goes into defining what famine is, right? We write about the intrigue in Somali and Kenyan elections that we're just discussing, right? And the challenges and the opportunities that come with that. But also we write about the president of Tanzania, the first female president in the region, and the complicated story of her rise to the top. And I think, as we write about the milk bars in Rwanda, and as much as we write about a dentist who's created the only ambulance service in Mogadishu, and how that is changing people's lives, and we write about the geopolitics of debt, and how China figures into that, and the environmental challenges that the activists are raising. And as much as we write about, this infrastructure has actually opened up entire regions to business and it connects people, but there are also all these other issues. I think bringing out those nuances is where the advocate in me comes out. I think, and it's not necessarily saying we have to write about the lion. The lion is roaring. The lion is, Africa is the future. East Africa has some of the youngest people in the world. We must write about them because of that. No. It's not about that. There are the trials and tribulations. There's the positive and the negative. There's a lot of shades of gray in between. And I think it's very, very important to tell that. That's Absolutely. Where I think I'm the advocate. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I was watching after the Morocco game. I'm calling it the Morocco game. I don't even remember who they beat. Oh, Portugal. They beat Portugal. And one of the Super Sport commentators, I don't know if you were watching that match. I'm sure you were. They said, Africa, your hour is nigh. I was like, nigh? Yeah. Please, welcome. Karibu to Africa. We've been about it for a long time. How are you going to tell us it's nigh? I was so annoyed by that phrasing because you're right. It's the lion is roaring. The fact of the matter is we have been creating and moving and, building since the beginning of time. So it's a matter of finding more paths, I think, for that story. And so I appreciate that answer. Okay, let me turn to some lighter questions. What have you learned as a reporter of this region that you didn't know as a national of this region?
That's a very, very good question. I think what I learned is to be skeptical and to question my own process of reporting much more. To be able to say, I would go into a Somali's mother's home to report a story about the famine or food prices increasing, and being able to walk in there and have the language and the vocabulary. I always thought it was easy. I always thought that, I'm going into this house. This is going to be easier for me than when I'm in southern Rwanda and I can't speak Kinyarwanda and I need a translator.
Right.
But I've learned that no, it's good to go into these conversations with as much more novelty as I would go to any other conversation if I was sent to southern France to report a story. And to be able to, and people will be like, in the past, maybe I would say, somebody would say, oh, yeah, you know that. You're a Somali, you know that. And I was like, yeah, I know that. But then I've gotten to a point where I was like, no, I actually don't. Explain it to me. What does it really mean? And that is where the greatest answers come out. So I learned more about myself as a Kenyan, covering the Kenyan election this year, which is fascinating. And traveling across the country.
What did you learn, Abdi? Now I have to know, what did you learn?
No, it was very interesting. I mean, particularly around the question of violence and how people look at violence and how violence is deployed and why this election, did not pan out. Like, there was a bit of what one day they were in the Rift Valley in Uasin County, and we had heard that some houses had been burnt the night before, and this was the days leading up to the results being, results were being counted, and immediately had that. Next morning we drove 3 hours into the this lush, beautiful village, and when we got there, it was like 2 houses that had been burnt, but about 400 people from different tribes within that community had already gathered for what they called a peace meeting. And they had lobbied themselves. They had congregated themselves. They got everybody to come out of their homes and sit in this church compound and basically talk about the importance of peace and why politicians will, debate and discuss and sort out their issues in Nairobi and in hotels, while people who are on the ground will be the ones who kill each other. And so in many ways, I went out reporting this election being like, yeah, we're going to see what happens. And we drove through tons and tons of counties and spoke to people across the country, and whether young people, old people, people in voting lines, people who are not voting. But it was that moment sitting in that village with hundreds of people, young, old, talking about the importance of peace and their loyalty to the idea of Kenya. It gave me so much hope, and it gave me it's sort of like, I don't want to say patriotic Kenyan, but it there were emotions that came inside me that I was like, I am supposed to be here right at this moment as a Kenyan covering this story. This is the moment I was born to be at and cover. And it was very, very important for me because I've always had complicated feelings about being a citizen and what it means and the duties and the responsibilities that you carry, particularly as a Kenyan Somali in a country where we are minority and there's tons of issues all the time. So that's what I learned. Yeah. But there are tons more other stuff too.
That's beautiful. Well, it sounds like you're going to come back not just once, but maybe twice. So you have to have, just a whole nother conversation. Abdi, I'm going to be one of those cousins on WhatsApp, texting you now, asking you to come back and again. But that's really a powerful thing. Did you get a chance to write about that by chance? What you observed?
No, it's definitely in my notebooks, along with so many other examples like that. But it's. Again, it's one of those things that, we were covering this election, the breadth of it. We had live briefings, basically reporting across the country, moving from county to county on election day when, election troubles were happening, when the results came out. And it was interesting to see the dynamism in this country and the idea of how do we share the pie? I think that conversation is happening at a much more intriguing level on the ground than is being portrayed on national media, because
Absolutely.
The national media is very narrow focused. It's focused on specific individuals, and being able to see that human aspect of it and on the ground was really fascinating, particularly for me as a Kenyan, and as a citizen of this country.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's really, it gives me a lot of hope as well. Okay, so we like to close out our show. The pillars I try and guide every show about is around justice and around joy. So, Abdi, 2 quick questions for you as we wrap up that I always want to know. 1, what brings you joy? And please tell us your favorite drink from Mogadishu. We're both Nairobians, so I just know you'll say chai or something, so we're not going to ask about Nairobi. But give us your favorite Mogadishu beverage and tell me what's bringing you joy.
What brings me joy? Quickly, yes, I think running brings me joy. I am not Eliud Kipchoge. Running brings me joy. I am not Eliud Kipchoge. I am not into the whole business of let's go do this marathons. I run marathons. I run half marathons. I love them, but I do them solo, and I make sure I do not run with my younger brother, who'll probably listen to this, because he is an incredible fast runner and very dedicated runner. He inspires me, but I'm like, bro, you go to the front. Goodbye. I will see you
He's your
600
pacer,
hours.
or not your pacer. That's great.
He's annoying in that sense. Yeah, he like goes and comes back, and I was like, "Are you not like supposed to be finishing this?" I'm like,
So
"I don't
disrespectful.
know, whatever."
So
Yeah, I was
disrespectful.
like, "Come." So running brings me joy, and it's something that I really, particularly running in Karura Forest, which, of course, as you know, like is linked to the history of Wangari Maathai and the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and who early on recognized the importance of parks and forests and the interconnectedness of deforestation and poverty and food insecurity and disenfranchisement. And I think that is, when I run in Karura, like that is buzzing in my head about the vision that she had, particularly in a city that is continuously where we are cutting trees and we are sort of like becoming, clearing spaces and building tall buildings. So that always sticks in my mind. So I always never take that for granted, and it brings me a lot of joy. One other thing I would mention, I think particularly this has sort of like taken an interesting turn over the past year or two, that brings me a lot of joy is great friendship and company. I think particularly around a table filled with good food. And I like the intellectual challenging conversations that come from those dinner tables. And it's, it's sort of like, the fact that they're fascinating people around the table talking about not just about themselves, but also about the bigger things in life. I think is very interesting. It reminds me of this quote by Toni Morrison in Beloved, where she says that, one character is like, he says that this woman, she's a friend of my mind. She gathers me, the pieces I am. She gathers me. She gathers them and then gives them back to me in all the right order. And that is what, over the past year or two, that has happened for me in my life, and I've really been grateful for that. I've had friends sitting at dinner tables who are just like able to hand me back whenever they leave my apartment, and I'm just like always like really grateful and holding on to that. And my beverage. Beautiful. Yes, it is. Yeah. And my beverage, from Mogadishu, I mean, what else are you going to say? Somali tea. Is there any other thing? But, this is the original Somali tea, though. This is like, I'm talking about cloves, cardamom, cinnamon, fresh ginger, and, Somalia has some of the most livestock in this continent. So this, in many ways, I mean, there's famine and also stuff happening now, or, at least bracing for famine. But, and there's a lot of fresh milk around. But I just love my tea with like the powdered milk. Yes. There's a lot of people who do with powdered milk and a bit of sugar. Oh my God.
Okay.
I sweat after that. Like every time I land in Mogadishu, I literally tell the hotel where I'm going to stay in advance, please, this is the first thing I want to have when I land. And I sweat it off, and I'm just like, okay, I think we're ready to do some work.
I'm home.
I'm home.
So powdered milk, cardamom, cloves, cinnamon, ginger. Okay, I'm going to put the recipe with this podcast in the show notes, and I'll have you fact check it. But Abdi, I hope to have you both around the mic and around a table again soon. This has been a real joy to talk to you. It's been a joy for me. And thank you. Thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you, Lilly. And you started this conversation with Binyavanga Wainaina. And one line from his book, One Day I'll Write About This Place That Stays With Me, is the last line in the book. And he basically says, we fail to trust that we knew ourselves to be possible from the beginning. And I just want to thank you, for inviting me and for believing that we are possible. We're possible.
That's just the perfect way to end this conversation. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Lilly. It's been an honor.